just a couple of months ago that protests erupted across the United States and the world after the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. Now, while it might have fallen off our radar, the protests have not stopped. In Portland, Oregon, they have continued almost nightly. Tensions continue to rise in the demand for change. Demonstrators and police have clashed, and there is news of federal officers in unmarked cars arresting people. President Trump is threatening to send this kind of law enforcement to more cities. Well, joining us to bring us up to speed with this story that we have completely forgotten is Garrison from Portland. Garrison, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me.
Look, you've been attending these protests. Can you bring us up to speed on the scenes you're experiencing there?
Yeah, so I mean, we started. There was the protest started in late May, centered around like Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, and they've continued every single night all the way up to now. There's been for all of June, there was a lot of response from the Portland police. That's where they were mainly sending tear gas and stuff into the crowd almost nightly. Since July, we've gotten more of a federal presence going on. But yeah, this has been happening nonstop in Portland ever since May.
So, Garrison, I want to ask you, we've seen some pretty harrowing footage of the protests that you yourself have shot. Can you tell us what the tensions are like between police and citizens now?
Right now, I mean, it's mainly focusing on the federal officers. The last kind of Portland police-centric action or protest was on Friday. This is when people marched to the police union building. They lit a small fire inside, and then the police tear gassed them and pushed them back into residential neighborhoods. But like what's been happening for like conflicts is that the first after like the first riot on the last Friday of May, there was really after that there was no really property damage done to the city besides that first riot night. And then police just continued to tear gas, though. So they didn't, even though the demonstrations were not causing property damage, they continued to tear gas as if property was continuing to be like vandalized or windows broken. And this is always continued and hasn't ever stopped yet. And now a lot of people here are kind of thinking, I mean, they're gonna tear gas us anyway. We may as well kind of do something to provoke the police and to have some kind of act of resistance because they're going to be met with the same response either way.
So we really are facing a chicken and the egg scenario. You're going to get tear gassed anyway, so you guys are like, well, we've got nothing to lose.
Exactly. That especially since the federal troops have kind of taken over trying to manage the protests, that has absolutely escalated during July. I mean, yesterday, the plywood covering up the windows of the federal courthouse was taken down. Someone lit one of the wooden boards on fire in front of the courthouse. Some windows were broken on the courthouse, but because on Friday, also at the same courthouse, a group of moms was tear gassed for doing nothing. They were just standing on the street, and then all these the next day on Saturday, this group of moms plus like 300 more plus 2,000 citizens of Portland all showed up, and you're like, well, if we're gonna get tear gassed just for standing, we may as well try to like take down parts of this wood on the building. So that's what we're seeing kind of happen now, is that the people of Portland are kind of less hesitant to mess with these government buildings. We still really haven't seen much violence against like any officers or any individuals besides like water bottles being thrown. I mean, I've seen a lot of water bottles. I saw some tomatoes yesterday being thrown.
At the police.
That's kind of like that's at the police, yeah. So that's the kind of that's a very kind of British old-timey way of handling
the violent protests are actually getting a lot more notice than the peaceful protests? Because I've got to be honest, with COVID-19 has completely gripped the world, and the Black Lives Matter movement was really taking off with the death of George Floyd. And we in Australia were watching these scenes unfold live on air as police were going in. But here in Australia, this has really just gone completely off the radar. And so I am genuinely surprised to hear that this is still happening. During the time that we were focused on it, we had Australian journalists caught up in the police rage. You know, police were actually caught hitting and kicking journalists, Australian journalists, who then went and testified in Congress. You're a journalist yourself. What's your experience been, and is that still happening?
It's absolutely happening. Portland is actually the worst city for that. Portland is right now #1 in police brutality against people and journalists from the past 60 days. There was one of my friends, another journalist, was named Corey Elia, was arrested and charged with a felony for stating an officer's name on his live stream. He recognized the officer and said, "Oh, hey, that's Officer Bartlett." And he was immediately tackled by 3 officers, and he's charged with felony assault of an officer. So we've seen a lot of violence and intimidation from the police towards journalists. I mean, I've been hit with sticks. I've had tear gas shot at my body, like a canister hitting my body. I've been hit with rubber bullets, pepper bullets. I have a big bruise on my leg right now from last night. I was shot with a rubber bullet. And I mean, I'm clearly marked press. I have press on my helmet. I have multiple press badges now. So yeah,
but that's not making a difference, right? We've seen this time and time again.
Yeah.
Having the word press is not making a difference. So what's the solution here? How is this going to stop, or is this going to keep going until Donald Trump's not in office?
I think there's a fair chance these protests could keep going to that point and even beyond that point, because even when the federal troops pull out, we still have a lot of people in Portland upset at the Portland Police Bureau, which is being controlled by our mayor. So I think I don't see these dying down anytime soon. I mean, I don't think there's any plans for the federal troops to be pulled out. And as long as they're here, there's going to be people protesting them every night. I mean, we've seen thousands and thousands of people every day for the past week, including on weekdays, which is crazy. To have 3,000 people out on a Tuesday night is just massive for a protest movement that started in May, and we're now at the end of July.
So, Garrison, can you tell me a little bit about those unmarked cars that we're hearing about with possible federal agents who are arresting people? Do you know if that's legal, and how widespread is that?
The legality is questionable because really there's no one that can really get these people in trouble, because these are a mix of Department of Homeland Security and a mix of Border Patrol people and U.S. Marshals that are conducting these. Some of them are arrests. Some of them are just temporary detainments. So basically just grabbing people off the street and holding them for hours and then just letting them go, usually trying to ask them questions so they can get any information out of them. But they've just been they've been driving around in rental cars. They've just been renting cars in sedans, SUVs and minivans in Portland, and just driving around and picking up anyone that's kind of in the outskirts of the city. This started around July 13th, was the first night I saw this happen. And I mean, it's tricky. I mean, there's people, there's stuff in the United States Congress that are trying to get these things to stop. There's stuff in our local state government in Oregon that is trying to make these things not be allowed. But it's very difficult because these groups really have less accountability than even the police do. So wow. It's hard to determine the legality of these actions.
How is how is COVID-19 affecting the protest movement over there? Because we have Black Lives Matter protests here, and there's a big controversy over the fact that they want more protests to go ahead. We've just had a second wave hit Victoria, which is feeding into New South Wales, where these Black Lives Matter protests are wanting to take place. They're saying they can social distance, wear masks and all that kind of stuff. But the government and police force is concerned, and our police force isn't like America, just to to point that out.
Yeah.
But there is concern that this could lead to a spread. How is the Black Lives Matter protesters where you are dealing with that side of things?
So, I mean, everyone here are wearing masks when they're out. For all of the food stations or medical supplies, there's people always giving out hand sanitizer. And overall, it looks like the protests are not contributing largely to growth of infections. I mean, we were really tracking that the first few weeks of the protest in June, and I think after 3 weeks of protesting in June, of nights where there was 10,000 people in the street, I think that there was only 5 confirmed cases of COVID that were tracked back to people at the protests.
Okay, so it obviously didn't lead to an infection from there.
No, not a huge, because the thing is everyone is outside, and outside transmission is way less likely to happen than indoor transmission, and especially if everyone's wearing masks in an interaction, the odds of it spreading like largely in there are not as big as like saying we have like 5 people in a small room talking, right? Those two things are like very, very different. When you have 10,000 people spread out, kind of marching through the streets, you're breathing mostly clean air. Everyone has masks on now. A lot of people have gas masks on now because of the amount of tear gas. So yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a general explosion of cases, at least here in Portland, that have been tracked back to the protests.
Well, Garrison, thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate you reporting for the Ben Robin Robbo Show. I feel like we should check in with you again live on the streets one night just to see how things are going. I'd love to get a full sense of what daily life is like. So we'll check in with you again. Thank you very much, Garrison.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
It's the Ben Robin Robbo, Ben Robin Robbo.